His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I am your host. And our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, I'm going to assume that you know that it's the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So that means we're celebrating, documenting events from 1776, pivotal year, a year of ups and downs. The highlight, you could say, is the publication of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, our nation's birthday, high hopes. But today we're going to look at the reaction, the other shoe that dropped, the empire striking back. We're talking about the Battle of Long Island, otherwise known as the Battle of Brooklyn by some. We're going to take a step out onto the field and describe the movement of troops, the people involved, what happened next. And to help us tell the story, we brought in someone who knows one battlefield after another. He's today's very special guest.
My name is Dan Davis. I am the principal for interpretation and special projects with the American Battlefield Trust. In other words, I'm one of the historians on the staff. The trust has been around for roughly about 30 years, and our primary mission is to preserve and interpret the battlefields from the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War.
First of all, Dan, thanks for talking with us today. We're going to be talking about the Battle of Long Island, but is this a particularly busy year for the Trust with the 250th anniversary upon us?
It is an exceptionally busy year for us with the 250th. This is actually in my quiet time. My schedule is going to start to amp up later in April and go all the way through to, I would say, the end of October. We've been filming in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia campaign will be back and filming in Philadelphia again. Actually, next month in just a few weeks, I'll be back in the city of brotherly love. We have one of our annual events being held there as well in October for our donors. So we are super busy with the 250th.
That's great. And, we'll mention your website and the work that you do. So they're the sites that you oversee or have preserved stretch. What's the geographic bounds, would you say?
From the East Coast up to actually Wood Lake in Minnesota, which is part of the 1862 Sioux War, and then all the way down to New Mexico at Glorieta Pass. And even farther than that, down to the Rio Grande at Palmito Ranch, the last battle of the Civil War.
And what's your path to this? How did you get involved in battlefields?
I grew up in Fredericksburg, Virginia, lived there still today. And what got me into it was my dad. My dad has always been a big fan of American history. And we spent our weekends going to the local battlefields, Civil War battlefields around Fredericksburg, the Revolutionary War sites. We go to Williamsburg, we go to Yorktown. We take summer vacations to Gettysburg, to the Alamo. And once that gets in your blood, it becomes a lifelong interest. You can't get it out. And so that's essentially what I pursued as I grew along through college. And I spent some time as a seasonal ranger at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, also at Appomattox Courthouse. And I started doing some contract work for the trust about 9 years ago or so, and then was hired on in the summer of 2018.
So just to maybe help us situate the trust, who are your natural allies, where do you fit, like within, say, the Park Service or heritage sites that are run by municipalities or private organizations?
Our biggest ally is the National Park Service, specifically the American Battlefield Protection Program. They administer a series of grants that they award really year round. And it's one of the most, I think, highly effective public and private partnerships that's out there right now. We work hand in hand with the National Park Service when we are able to raise money to save a particular parcel or tract of land. Oftentimes we get a matching grant for that from the American Battlefield Protection Program. At the same time, we work very closely with a number of states and local municipalities. For instance, our most recent effort is here in Virginia in Culpeper, where we have preserved roughly about 2,500 acres between three different battlefields, Civil War battlefields in Culpeper, and we have gifted that land to the Commonwealth of Virginia, to the people of Virginia, and it is called the Culpeper Battlefield State Park, and it's the newest state park in the Virginia park system.
It's interesting. I've been to Gettysburg. I've been to a few. So in terms of, before we get to the specifics of Long Island, in terms of preserving a battlefield, what's the experience you're hoping people get in terms of it, like the cross between being a museum, being an open space, a park-like atmosphere? Like what's the ideal that you're going for in terms of how you're preserving it and what you're presenting?
Well, we want to present the public with an outdoor classroom that can be used K through 12, high school, college, even military today to study the past and to learn from, take away lessons, learn from mistakes that individuals made, learn from the successes of various individuals who fought on those fields. But I think at the very basic level of preservation is that we want to take the land and put it back if it isn't already there. We want it to look like it did on the day of the battle. So if the soldiers who fought there, they were to come back 160, 250 years or so later, they would be able to recognize that that land has not changed since in the last 200 years or so. Many times we'll buy properties, we'll have houses on the properties, buildings. Those are going to come down. We're going to take those down and help restore the landscape to what it would have looked like at the time of the battle.
Gotcha. So how much do you know about the Battle of Long Island to start?
A little bit here and there. I've spent much of my time with the American Revolution due to some of our efforts with the Trust, mainly with the Liberty Trail, which is an effort to preserve and interpret landscapes in South Carolina, where we have since expanded that out to a number of different states. We're working on New York, actually, as we speak. My focus has been mainly on the American Revolution in the South. And when I came to the Trust, I sort of shifted my focus because the organization was shifting their focus. So I've gone really from 19th century back to the 18th century. So I know a little bit about Long Island.
Okay. And I did a deep dive myself. We usually don't cover Brooklyn as much, but this is pre-consolidation Brooklyn, so we will call it part of Long Island for the sake of the discussion. And when you're just talking about restoring the original vistas or the original look of it, and my first thought, well, there's nothing going to be left in modern day Brooklyn. But as I dug deeper and you look at the parks and the geography, I was surprised at how much you could go to and actually almost say the landscape is pretty close to the original geography. I don't know if you have an initial thought on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And oftentimes, especially within urban areas, those landscapes don't often change. Where there's hills, 250 years ago, occasionally you're still going to find those hills. I think a great example along with Long Island is Bunker Hill in Charlestown, just outside of Boston, where the urbanization of it has really taken over the battlefield. However, if you walk certain parts of the field, you can still see when you walk up to Breed's Hill, where the Bunker Hill Monument is located, you're walking uphill. In some places it's a very steep ascent, and you can see that in other parts of the battlefield too. So sometimes, even because there is urbanization and development, the landscape will, although it's not open as it would have been at the time of the battle, you still get a good sense of the terrain.
No, and terrain is a good point, because when you mentioned the military educational value, if we look at this landscape in Brooklyn as a battlefield and the topography, the geography of it, I mean, it did seem defensible. So there's a ridge. We've talked about the glacier in the past. So there's this ridge of hills across northeastern Brooklyn going into Queens. And so there were heights, all these names, Brooklyn Heights and things like that, kind of tells you that there was a geography to it. You think of Long Island as flat almost, but there were ridges and passes. And so from a military standpoint, what can you say about the terrain and maybe the positions that Washington had established, or what historians have said? Did he have a chance of winning if things had gone differently with the terrain?
I think yes and no. I think with the terrain as far as Washington is concerned, I think they do as much as they possibly can to fortify the heights of Guyana, which I think we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But also behind that, there are a series of fortifications that the Continentals built. And Washington at least had the foresight, I think, even before the British evacuated Boston, actually 250 years ago this past Tuesday on St. Patrick's Day. Washington had sent one of his subordinates, Charles Lee, to New York. So he had the prescient thought, thinking that if the British leave Boston, they're probably headed to New York. So he had that foresight to send Charles Lee, one of his subordinates, there to assess the situation, begin preparing for the defense of New York. I think what really hampers Washington at Long Island are two things. One, he has a collapse in command with his officers, and he also has an untried, untested army that is taking on arguably the best fighting force in the world at that time at the Battle of Long Island. So it's really it's the first major open field battle of the American Revolution. Becomes one of the largest as well, along with Brandywine. So even with the terrain, I think Washington had to deal with issues with his command, and he also the inexperience of the men under him.
Yeah, and I've seen different numbers, but at least outnumbered 2-1, would you say is fair?
Yes. Yeah, easily.
Yeah. So the Gowanus Heights was the first line, and then Brooklyn itself, which was not the whole borough then, Brooklyn was its own village where Brooklyn Ferry would land. So Brooklyn was sort of the settlement right across Manhattan, and that was the second line of defense militarily. Is that kind of close to the layout?
Yes.
Okay. And so these heights, and there were passes through that. So the rebels were on these heights guarding these passes, right, that could be used to get to that main camp in Brooklyn. And you mentioned Boston. So earlier that year, Washington had freed Boston, interestingly, because he had taken the heights right outside of Boston.
Yep, he takes the heights at Dorchester, which is would have been just south of the city. You can still visit it today. Again, overcome by urbanization, but at the same time, there's some really steep hills in Dorchester. And he's able to put artillery up there that commands the entire harbor and the town, which forces the British to evacuate Boston. The British commander, William Howe, who's going to be at Long Island, he had already laid plans to evacuate Boston at some point early in the year. When Washington occupies Dorchester Heights, that just accelerates Howe's plans.
So that just shows you how important that terrain was. I guess one quick question, New York Harbor, why could the British fleet not just have sailed down the East River and kind of taken care of things by sea?
Well, they attempt to do that later on in the campaign, but you want to have that. The British Army throughout the course of the American Revolution is tethered to their Navy. They're tethered to the sea because that is their main line of supply outside of the colony. So when the British initiate operations, they have to locate and find deep water ports so that they can then bring supplies in, reinforcements, munitions, everything that is necessary to equip an army and sustain an army in the field by their Navy into those ports. And then they sort of filter out into the surrounding countryside. New York is it's one of the largest cities in the colonies. It has that deep water harbor to support the capacity for every ship that is in the British Navy at the time. And there's also a going thought that New York has a very strong loyalist contingent, individuals who are still friends of King George III who will come to the support of the British Army. So that's really why New York becomes a focal point for Howe after he leaves Boston.
Okay, and so just to walk through the battle, the British land on Staten Island unopposed and then move all the troops or most of the troops into the lower lying, southern part of Brooklyn and start advancing. It starts the night of August 27th?
26th into the 27th.
So again, all these passes, if you keep those in mind, this helps me think through it. So there were basically along the Gowanus Heights, we had 3 clusters of American forces, and then there was another pass further east in East New York, what is now East New York, that was sort of left unguarded. That's kind of not the myth, but is that the Achilles heel of this whole thing? That last pass, they didn't go fortify that eastern boundary.
That is the Achilles heel. That is Jamaica Pass, and that is the pass that the British are going to utilize on a wide, swinging flank march to get around the American left and then get into the American rear. You have to go back, and I think the beginnings of that plan really are on June 17th, 1775 at Bunker Hill, when the British win the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they take tremendous casualties. And men like William Howe, who was in charge of the operation there, and Henry Clinton, who watched the battle from the Boston side. It came over to Charlestown in the latter stages of the fighting. They had, I think, collectively decided that we are not going to send our men in these long lines uphill against a fortified American position ever again. And so Henry Clinton conducts a scouting mission, and he finds that the Jamaica Pass is open. He pitches the plan to William Howe. Howe, for whatever reason, initially brushes the plan aside, but eventually approves it. And Clinton ultimately, Charles Cornwallis, who actually major player in the war later on, they take about 10,000 men on this wide arcing march around the American left.
So it's really that plan developed pretty close to the battle. They didn't know about the pass until they were in the area.
Yeah, I would say so. Clinton does not know about the pass. The pass is unguarded until he actually undertakes that scouting mission. And
that's back to the point about the loyalists. I've read some accounts where it's loyalists that lead them to that Jamaica Pass.
Yes, I believe so. They do have local guides. Obviously, the British are, Clinton and his subordinates Howe as well, are unfamiliar with the terrain. And that's something that the British will utilize throughout the course of the war. I mentioned earlier the Battle of Brandywine. It's another wide swinging flank movement around Washington's right. And that flanking column, led by Charles Cornwallis again, is led by local guides, loyalists.
So there are some points that will come up later when we talk about where the battlefield is today. So when you talk about these types of battles and you say the American left or the American right, are you talking about the British facing the Americans and then their left is the American left, or is it the Americans looking south and then so their left is to the east?
Yeah, so the American left would be the British right, or
okay,
to the east, and the American right would be the British left.
Okay. So if we go to the American west, which is sort of the Gowanus area towards the river, that's Alexander, Lord Stirling is on Battle Hill. And then you've got, is it Sullivan on Bedford Pass, which is sort of the middle defense. And so I guess part of the tactic was the British were attacking these two that side of the battlefield, right? There was Hessians in the middle. There was a Major Grant. So as a feint, they were making Washington think they're coming from the west, from the water, when actually they were swinging around from the east in Jamaica Pass.
That is correct. The British forces, the Hessians, along with the augmented Hessian force, demonstrate in front of the American right, sort of keep the American Continental's attention on that sector of the line to allow time for Clinton and Cornwallis to complete their flank march. Once Clinton gets into position, he fires, I believe, 2 signal shots from artillery, which signals to those British and Hessian forces that is time to make the attack. The flanking force is in position, and they are going to move forward as well, like sweeping into the American rear.
And it pretty much, would you say, collapses pretty quickly?
It collapses really quickly. There's, in some instances, I think there's very little resistance that's given by the Americans. You mentioned Lord Stirling. He does a pretty good job, I think, at Long Island. Somewhat of an unheralded performance on his part, because he takes a portion of his force, regiment of Marylanders, along with men from Delaware, under the command of a fellow named William Smallwood. And he fights a delaying action that allows time for the Americans to withdraw safely from the battlefield.
Right. And so they fall back to that second line, which was what was then Brooklyn proper, behind another line of forts, which was Putnam was in charge. So in terms of the chain of command there, and you tell me if this is right, Washington was mostly in Manhattan, or did he came over for the actual day of the battle, but Putnam was the person in Brooklyn at the top?
Yep, Israel Putnam, and and you bring this up because this is an interesting aspect of the battle that I think kind of gets overlooked and sort of what is such a detriment to the Continental Army. When Washington is on Manhattan Island, he comes over, of course, several times in the days leading up to the battle to observe the British movements, assess the situation, assess the defenses. But I think we have to go back, and I think one of the points that is missed is that Putnam was not the original commander on Long Island. It was Major General Nathaniel Greene, who I think has developed a good relationship at that point in time with Washington. He has a good relationship, I think, with the men in the ranks from the perspective that he had been with the Army since the siege of Boston. So he had been in the Army for the better part of the year. Unfortunately for the Continentals, he is taken ill. He's suffering from a fever. He is out of action, so he misses the battle. Command then devolves to John Sullivan, but because of seniority, it is Israel Putnam, who is, I think, well past his time. He's getting up there in age. He then takes over command on Long Island. So I think there's this collapse in the chain of command that also hampers the Continental efforts there as well.
Did Washington ever take the field in Brooklyn?
I don't believe so. I think he remains in Manhattan. I think I want to say he that night after the battle, he does come over. He does cross the East River over to the Brooklyn side, and then you have somewhat famous evacuation of Brooklyn across the East River to Manhattan.
Okay, and another just small indignity. So one of those, there were forts along this final line of defense, and one was Fort Putnam, which has become Fort Greene. So they renamed it. They removed Putnam from the map. I don't know if that was for spite or just other reasons to commemorate Greene. So in terms of, it was one of, if not the biggest battle of the war, would you say one of the bloodiest? Do we know roughly casualty figures?
It's not the bloodiest. I think the bloodiest of the war is, in fact, Bunker Hill, as far as casualties are concerned. But as we've discussed, there's very little fighting on the part of the Americans. The line collapses really quickly.
And we'll just mention, you talked about Alexander and the Maryland 400. I'm not sure what their actual regiment name was, but they've been honored because they fought this rearguard action, kind of stalled the British by basically sacrificing themselves, charging at this insurmountable foe.
Yeah, and you're talking about, when you talk about the Marylanders and the Delaware troops in the Continental Army, this is the unit that will become the elite of the Continental Army. This is the cream of the crop, and they will be involved in many of the major actions of the Continental Army, both in the northern and then eventually the southern theater. So you're talking about, when you talk about the Marylanders at Long Island, these are the best of the best.
And so there's, the aftermath is America's Dunkirk, they call it sometimes. We were able to evacuate most of the army, and then the running battle north out of Manhattan through Westchester and living to fight another day. You brought up Bunker Hill, and sort of this is now flashing into the aftermath. So Long Island and New York are occupied for the rest of the war. As America starts after the war and sort of we turn to our history and preserving some of these, New England and Boston take an early lead or are very cognizant of remembering. So Bunker Hill becomes a national touch point. If we look at what the generation after the war, how much attention they paid to these sites, and maybe was the Battle of Brooklyn because it was a Battle of Long Island because it was a loss, people didn't immediately turn it into a hallowed ground site like Bunker Hill. And do you have any initial thoughts on?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's something to that. Certainly, Bunker Hill. Although it's a British, it's a tactical victory. It's really considered an American victory as well. So and it's also the first major battle that's fought in the American Revolution, at least in New England. I think what's interesting though is that, as you mentioned, New York is such a tragic loss for the Continental Army and for Washington that it's better off, I think, for those men to be forgotten, because by the time that Washington eventually begins his retreat across New Jersey, and later on in the year, November, December 1776, his army is literally withering on the vine. It's coming apart at the seams. So New York doesn't have that memory for, I think, some of the soldiers who fought there. They look at Bunker Hill, they look at some of the battlefields in the South, Yorktown, obviously, but it doesn't get that attention, I think, from the veterans, which I think is really interesting, because when you look at it from Washington's perspective, Washington, I think, takes the defeat at New York at a personal level. And you see him through the remainder of the American Revolution. His army, he has the main force around New York. And in fact, he is, and especially after the French enter the war, he is constantly entertaining plans of retaking the city because it's such a blight on his military record. It's a blight on his honor. He lost New York. He has to take back New York. And he's even planning, one, to try to retake New York in the summer and fall of 1781 when the Yorktown campaign commences. And even after Yorktown, there's still a British army in North America, and it's in New York. So Washington brings the Continental Army from Virginia back to New Jersey and New York. And he's planning, even after Cornwallis's surrender, to launch a major effort and recapture New York. And you see where Washington is, and I think he gets, in his mind, some vindication when the British finally evacuate their troops from North America. Where is he at? He's in New York. He rides triumphantly back into New York as sort of that redemption from that loss, that sting earlier in the war. So what's interesting is that while the veterans may not remember, it sits in Washington's craw for the remainder of the conflict.
So we can talk about. I was going through old issues of the Brooklyn Eagle and in the 1800s. So it seems like every year on the anniversary there would be articles commemorating and kind of picking over the ground what was still extant in terms of, I guess, fortifications. Or I've also talked to a historian that has studied the British forts that they constructed on Long Island, and some of them are still, you can see like just the rise in the hill, very, very subtle hints of what was there. And from your experience, what can you say about, again, this generation after the war, how America started treating its battlefields, and did it change by region, wwhether they kind of honored it or it got forgotten?
I think it changes by region, and I think it changes by event. Obviously, we talked about that the loss of New York is somewhat sort of forgotten a little bit amongst the veterans, but I think it's also regional. And you see this specifically, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit. You see that with the Battle of New Orleans, another major battle against the British during the War of 1812, 8th of January, 1815. And this is a battle that really takes on a whole life of its own. And from 1815 up until really the Civil War, there are 3 holidays that are celebrated in the United States: Washington's birthday, the 4th of July, and the 8th of January, to commemorate the Battle of New Orleans. And I think that also has to do with the fact that it's a major victory versus that is in the forefront of the public mindset for so long. But at the same time, again, Long Island is that's one of those battles that it's a terrible American defeat, and it's not really, the veterans don't really want to remember. Veterans tend to, and you see this in the American Revolution, the Civil War, they tend to want to remember their victories.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And for a long time, we celebrated Evacuation Day, which was when the British left in 1783.
Mm-hmm.
So my discoveries that surprised me a little bit, going back to the geography. So these were rises or height, hills across Brooklyn, and maybe because those were harder to develop, as the 19th century progressed, a lot of those spots on the hills became, for example, Greenwood Cemetery in 1838, which was where Alexander was holding the line there. And then a little bit later, I think right after the Civil War, Prospect Park, which is a little bit to the middle of the defenses. So it's interesting that at least at that point, there were pockets of the battlefield still extant and still kept in their natural state. I guess how far is too far to say, let's piece this battlefield back together?
I think it'd be pretty difficult today, especially with all that urbanization. Talking about, you tend to talk about buying, literally like one house at a time to restore it. So places like, not that it cannot be done, but I think places like that, I think, unfortunately, we've completely lost them to development.
So, and I know on your site you have pages and information about different battlefield sites. Is the trust involved at all with this battlefield in terms of doing programming or tours or anything like that?
It is going to be part of our, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, it is going to be part of our Liberty Trail app, our Liberty Trail website, which is, again, tracing and preserving what we can of battlefields of the American Revolution. We are working on a New York campaign, a Battle of New York portion of that app that we, in fact, while we aren't doing any programming there on site, we are putting together content that individuals can take out with them when they explore these battlefields and access it while they're on the ground there themselves. So yes, it is part of some of what we're doing, our ongoing efforts. It should be coming out sometime later this summer.
From your experience or what you've seen and studied, what kind of artifacts, as you go over a field, or as the 1800s went into the 1900s, were people finding artifacts on these sites, or were they known for? There's the phenomenon of pot hunters kind of digging up things. What kind of was the experience at different battlefields that in terms of people finding evidence of the past?
I think one of the biggest things that I think always stands out to folks is the recovery, the archaeological recovery of anything related to a weapon that would have been carried by obviously a soldier, but also some of those personal effects that you might find, like a non-issue regulation knife, a pocket knife, a ring, a locket, something that had a personal value to the individual. I think those are the things that really that you find across all wars. And those are also the items I think that have those tug at the heartstrings, because it makes those individuals, although they lived 250 years ago, relatable to us today.
In terms of the trust sites, are there archaeological digs going on at some point, or do you open it up or do collaborations if someone wants to study a redoubt that might still be there, or try to find evidence?
We have just actually recently in South Carolina at the Camden battlefield did an archaeological dig in conjunction with our partners in the state of identifying known graves on the battlefield. And I mentioned the Marylanders. We talked about the Marylanders earlier. It's the same Marylanders men who may have fought at Long Island. Some of their graves were discovered. Archaeology was done. And there's another unit, one of the other units that fights at Long Island on the British side, the 71st Regiment of Foot. We found an individual from the 71st Regiment of Foot that was identified by one of, I believe, a button on his coat, if I recall that correctly. So we do occasionally will do archaeological digs. They are pretty, and we have worked with archaeological groups in the past. AVAR, the American Veterans Archaeological Recovery Group. Fantastic group. Work very closely with them and sponsoring them and working hand in hand as we explore various aspects of those battles, because I'm here to tell you the land still has stories to tell. It's just underneath the dirt.
Great. I just have a few more questions, and I'll give you a chance to anything we might have missed. Because I was going through your site, and what was interesting to me, so we've been talking a lot about the preservation of these sites as hallowed ground and pieces of history, but there's other benefits and side effects of that in terms of ecology maybe and things like that. So what other things would you say about why preserve these, what are usually big swaths of land, open land?
I think, obviously, I mean, the first reason is these lands are part of our shared American experience, especially in the formidable years, the first century of the United States. The history of the United States was not necessarily formed and haggled over in courtrooms. It was decided on these battlefields, these hallowed grounds, and those battles taken all together help influence and still reverberate today the type of country that we have. So they're part of our shared experience. I think in many instances, too, moving beyond that, and I see this a lot, especially in the Washington, D.C. area, with all the development in the last 20 or so years, many of these places have become green space for individuals. It's the only green space they have where they can run, they can bicycle, they can walk their dogs, they can take their kids. That's not where you don't feel that the pressure of urbanization and development.
No, and it's actually I like the idea that, and you're talking about if a veteran came back and walked those fields, it would look like what they experienced. And yet there's a sort of almost like a calmness to it. As you're saying, if it's a pocket of open space surrounded by the modern world, you can kind of reflect, and it's a little quieter there, even though it was a sign of great a site of great violence and chaos at the moment. So is there anything we didn't get to or anything you want to emphasize before we wrap up?
Head over to battlefields.org, check out our website, see what we're doing, the efforts that we have going on across the United States, and hope to see you on a battlefield sometime.
That's a big thank you to Dan and everyone at the American Battlefield Trust. They're at battlefields.org. It's a great way to learn American history, and definitely check out their listings next time you're planning your vacations. Try to get out there and experience some of this for yourself, minus the battles, of course. That does it for this episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.